I recently made 2 videos about Wendy Adelson and her words and action that may indicate her involvement in the unaliving of her ex-husband, Dan Markel. And this got me thinking about Sebastian Rogers' case and the potential guilt of his mother, Katie Proudfoot, and his stepfather, Chris Proudfoot. So much of their behavior and words have screamed to me that they likely know more than they're saying. This is just my opinion. Neither one of them has been charged in connection with Sebastian's disappearance. Today, I'm going to go through what I believe are potential indicators of Chris and Katie Proudfoot's involvement in Sebastian's disappearance. Let's begin. 1. Prior to Sebastian vanishing, Chris and Katie Proudfoot were dealing with no less than 5 CPS reports. Chris Proudfoot was also in the middle of a contentious child custody dispute with his ex-wife, wife number 4, Nina Gomez. Gomez accused Chris of DV against her and her 2 young children from a previous marriage. All of these things make for a potentially dangerous home life for Sebastian in the Proudfoot home. These are red flags by anyone's standards. 2. Chris and Katie Proudfoot were also trying to arrange to have Sebastian either go to live with his biological father, Seth Rogers, or to live in a reform school for troubled boys. Clearly, the Proudfoots wanted Sebastian out of their home for the majority of the time. You have to wonder if the plan for getting Sebastian out was not moving fast enough for the Proudfoot. And of course, we're going to find Sebastian's disappearance against this familial backdrop suspicious. 3. On Sunday, February 25th of 2024, the day before Sebastian went missing, his mother gave him an incredibly full day of activities and niceties. She made him a homemade breakfast. She and Sebastian chatted with family members. They picked up a niece in the family. They went to BJ's, where Sebastian supposedly consumed a colossal-sized popcorn, which Katie emphasized with her hands. They went bowling. They dined out at the Texas Roadhouse, where Sebastian gobbled up some grilled salmon, and Katie appeared to nibble at just bread. This day was so jam-packed and designed to make Sebastian happy that many of us have wondered if this was one last hurrah for a child that would soon go missing from his house. Number 4. Chris and Katie Proudfoot did not immediately reach out to the local news after they realized Sebastian was missing. Instead, they waited something like 7 to 8 days and then went to various YouTubers. Why go to social media before you speak on TV? And why wait so long? Surely the exposure of local news stations would have had a greater reach in the actual area where Sebastian went missing. And I believe trained, seasoned reporters would have asked the most critical questions as opposed to random YouTubers. It wasn't until day 8 that Chris and Katie finally appeared on a local news station. 5. As Katie spoke to more reporters and YouTubers, her story as to what happened on Sunday night changed and evolved. At first, Katie mentioned hearing Sebastian playing in his room about an hour after she sent him to bed. She sent him to bed at 9, and she said she heard noises in his room at around 10. Later, Katie described the sound as a thud. When a loved one goes missing, you want to be as accurate as possible, and thus you want to tell the truth. But we know truth doesn't change. Thus, logic dictates that Katie Proudfoot likely wasn't telling the truth about this sound. I'm going to say allegedly, though, because she hasn't been charged with any crime so far. 6. When Katie described what happened early Monday morning, On February 26, 2024, the day she reported Sebastian missing, she used an unusual wording. Katie said, quote, "When I woke him up for school, he wasn't there," end quote. This makes it sound like she really did wake him up, or at least try to, but he wasn't there. Was this because he was deceased? Early on, Seth Rogers said that he thought it was possible that Katie maybe gave Sebastian too much of his sleeping medication. And during many of her interviews, Katie keeps her eyes down. She doesn't look at the interviewer. To me, when you have nothing to hide, you look directly at the person you're speaking to. You don't go out of your way to avoid their gaze. But in my opinion, when you're lying and you're self-conscious about it, you try to avoid the person's eyes. 7. Katie left her home that Monday and yelled out to her neighbors that her son was missing. She also got into her vehicle and took off for Sebastian's nearby school. But according to 2 anonymous sources, one of whom spoke to Sweetie Pie Low, Katie pulled into the school and then quickly peeled off, not bothering to go inside and let the administration know that Sebastian was missing and that they should keep their eyes open. 8. During interviews, Katie smiles and laughs at times as she describes Sebastian's typical behavior in the house, things like him hiding behind places and then jumping out to try and scare her. Katie does not seem teary or sad at all times during these interviews, and these were very early on, so you'd think she'd be incredibly emotional. And Chris, too, when he speaks about Sebastian, is utterly cold and disconnected. Early on, Chris Proudfoot declared that all 3 parents had been cleared, when law enforcement hasn't ever said that. Chris seems so determined to sell this idea that they've all been vetted and cleared, and that the police are behind that when they aren't. Number 10, Seth Rogers said that the Proudfoots stopped talking to him after Sebastian went missing, and this was about a 2-week period where they would not answer his calls or speak to him. Why were they avoiding Seth if they had nothing to hide? They should have all been embracing one another and trying to work together. Chris and Katie need to be prompted during their interviews to speak directly to Sebastian and to send him a message. They also failed to address a potential kidnapper when giving those interviews. This is something that the parents of kids who are truly missing and whose parents don't know where they are do. Katie said she called Chris mere minutes after she couldn't find Sebastian at around 6 a.m. So why did it take Chris so long to get home from Memphis to Hendersonville, Tennessee? That 228-mile drive should take, on average, 3 hours and 24 minutes. But according to Chris, he didn't get home until 1 p.m. If he was truly frantic about his so-called son being missing, and if Katie really needed him home for support, I should think that he would head straight home and get there much earlier. Instead of rushing home, Chris takes 6 to 7 hours to arrive in Hendersonville. What was he doing that was more important than rushing home to help Katie look for Sebastian? 14. Chris and Katie say with confidence that Sebastian walked out the door of their home. How can they be so sure of this? This speaks to them knowing that Sebastian walked out the door. And the only way they could know that with certainty is if one or both of them witnessed that happening. 15. The 3 a.m. flashlight video. When a child goes missing overnight and the house where he lives has two mysterious lights that seem to be moving outside of it at 3 a.m. in the pitch dark, you have to conclude that those lights are connected to the disappearance. It's simply too much of a coincidence that the lights were seen outside Sebastian's house. Some have tried to say these were lights from garbage trucks, but number one, garbage trucks don't arrive in the neighborhood until 5 a.m. 2, the lights are on the grassy areas between the Proudfoots' home and a neighbor's, so they're not on the street. And it seems as though the two lights were only seen outside Sebastian's house. No other houses in the neighborhood have reported seeing those two lights show up on security camera footage. If they were picked up outside all the houses, or if some of the houses maybe had those two lights as well, then I might believe they weren't connected to Sebastian's disappearance. But that's not the case. And not only are there two lights that appear to be flashlights that two people are carrying and walking around with, then there's also a mysterious car that appears right around the same time, 2:58 a.m., and its movements are very suspicious. It drives past Stafford Drive, turns down Kellen Drive, then turns around on Kellen Drive and drives back down it, and then it turns on to Stafford Drive, which is where Sebastian lives. Everyone's been trying to figure out how Sebastian managed to get out of that house without being picked up on a camera, and I submit to you that he did get picked up on a camera. It just happens to be one where you can't actually see him. You see the two lights and the car. That's my opinion. 16. Although Katie says she discovered Sebastian missing around 6 a.m., she and Chris didn't call the authorities until 6:33 a.m. Every minute counts when a child goes missing. Law enforcement often refer to the first 3 hours, and the statistics are that about 76% of abducted children who are unalived are done in within the first 3 hours. So every minute and every half hour matters. 17. Chris and Katie did not organize public searches like we saw with Maya Miliete and her family. When a missing person is loved and cherished, the family wants to find them, and they can't rest until that person is found. You don't give up, especially so early after the person vanishes, and you don't move away from your house for any period of time because the hope is that the child will find their way back to their house. 18. In Chris and Katie's interview on Duchess's channel, Chris refers to Sebastian as, quote, the young man, and Katie as, quote, the mom. By using these terms, Chris shows an emotional distance when it comes to Sebastian and his mother, Katie. Chris isn't saying at that point, our son. Over time, Chris changes his wording, and suddenly he starts mentioning our son. But I would say that this is him learning what he was criticized for in the earliest interviews. So he's evolving his language as he learns what people think. 19. Chris and Katie said they were on the phone that night, Sunday night, from 9:43 p.m. per Chris until midnight. Is this something they do every night, or was this a rare occurrence? What were they talking about for such a long period prior to Sebastian going missing? It seems very strange. Teenagers in love spend hours on the phone late at night, not adults, at least typically. And given that this was the night Sebastian vanished, it's a red flag. 20. Chris said that this case is one to be studied. That makes it sound like he knows what happened, and he knows the beginning of the crime and the end of the crime. Why is it one to be studied? It hasn't been solved yet. That's a very odd thing to say. Chris also said very conclusively that there aren't any clues. How is he so sure of this? Now, I know that Steve Fisher of SF Investigates has been working for Katie and Chris Proudfoot, and I think that maybe that points to Chris Proudfoot being so sure that they dotted all their I's and crossed all their T's that even a private investigator won't figure out what happened to Sebastian. I think that this also potentially speaks to Chris's narcissism, arrogance, and confidence in thinking that no one will ever really figure out what happened to Sebastian. And how can he know that unless he was involved? Just my opinion. 21. Chris says in interviews that he, Katie, and Seth Rogers spoke regularly and had no animosity, that they were co-parenting Sebastian very effectively. We know now that that's not true. Why did he lie about that? Why did Chris feel the need to portray himself, Seth, and Katie as having a very good co-parenting relationship? Chris seems like he always wants to make himself and Katie seem like stellar, caring parents who are evolved enough to work with Seth Rogers. But remember, Seth wasn't aware of the 5 CPS reports, so they weren't exactly being open about what was going on. Chris and Katie, during interviews, don't ask for tips, and they don't give out the tip line. Why aren't they desperate to ask the public to share all credible tips? 23. Why don't we see Chris and Katie more in the news? Why don't we see them organizing searches? Why are they only showing up occasionally on the panels of late-night YouTube channels? And actually, it's usually only Chris Proudfoot who shows up. Katie is mostly silent, and she's the one who was home when Sebastian went missing. So she's the one with the first-hand knowledge of what went down that night. Why is Chris speaking, and why is Katie silent? Those are the indicators that I have initially come up for this case. I'm sure there are a ton of other ones. The bottom line is Chris and Katie do not seem like people who are eager to get Sebastian back home, despite what they say. Again, they were trying to find ways to get Sebastian out of their home before he went missing. So it makes the most sense that they would be the ones with the motive for wanting him gone. There's always a motive behind every crime. See you next time on Bed Crime Stories.